Welcome, everyone. My name is Pam Rowland, and I'm the Director of Education for the Institute. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're so excited to be in person. Before I continue, I would like to introduce other staff members from the Institute. We have our Executive Director, Tracy, and we have a wonderful environmental educator, Lynn Teach, with us. So if you have any questions about the Institute, see one of us. So tonight, I'd like to draw your attention to our calendar of events. And everyone should have one. We have a star party coming up on Monday night at Pine Hill. It was canceled in December, and we're hoping we can actually, we hope to pull it off on Monday night, but I already heard it's looking a little cloudy. We also have a story walk on March 13 at Pine Hill. And then next Thursday night, we have part 2 of Penn's Woods, and Andre Weltman will be our speaker talking about the iron industry. Any questions? We have seats up here. I'd like to also draw your attention to our back table. If you would like to become a member of the Institute, we have cards in the back. And we also have our Woodsy Owl in the back on the table if you would like to make a donation tonight. Tonight, our program is sponsored by several people. It is underwritten by Robert and Grace Brown, and her daughter Kathy's here tonight with them. So thank you for underwriting the program. We'd also like to thank the Church of the Apostles for this great fellowship hall, and it's a great place to meet. So we thank them for that. I also like to read our sponsorship list. Thanks to our today's Horizon Fund contributors, which include the Nora Roberts Foundation, the John R. Hershey Jr. and Anna L. Hershey Family Foundation, Alma Oyer, APX Enclosures, Inc., and Carolyn Terry Eddy family, with Carolyn and her daughters, Kim Larkin and Connie Flegel. So we thank them all for their underwriting. An important thing you'll need to know, bathrooms are to the right behind the folding door. And any other questions before I introduce Claire? Okay. We're so happy to have Claire tonight. Claire Jantz is a native of East Tennessee, and she joined the faculty of Shippensburg University in 2005 after earning her master's and PhD from the University of Maryland. She currently serves as a professor in the Geography Earth Science Department, and she is the director of the Center for Land Use and Sustainability at Shippensburg. She has spent the last 17 years exploring the Michaux State Forest and other public lands in South Central Pennsylvania. And she serves as the chair of the Friends of Michaux State Forest, which we're glad to partner with tonight. And that was formed, the Friends of Michaux were formed in 2019. She works with the foresters in Michaux as a volunteer and also as a professional. And she currently works with a team from the university, DCNR, and All Trails Research on a trail assessment and a trail plan for the Mountain Creek area in the Michaux State Forest. So Claire, we are happy to have you here, and you've got quite a crowd tonight. And thank you again for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming tonight. I was really pleased to be invited by the Institute. I've been working with the Institute for a long time. A lot of our students have interned with the Institute over the years. So I was really pleased to come. And I'll say that I'm a geographer, and if you know about geographers, geographers know a little bit about a lot. And that is what my talk is going to be like tonight. If I can get this to go. So I'm going to try to cover about 10,000 years of history tonight. So a little bit about a lot of things. But I'm really glad that Andre Weltman is here because Andre knows a lot about the history of Michaux. And John Waugh also helps with this presentation. He's manning the Zoom, and he's also done a lot of work with the Native American Rhyolite, which I'll touch on. So this is a team effort, I guess, this evening. I'm also coming to you from the Friends of Michaux, and I'll land on a slide at the end that has our email and website on it. But just to give you a little bit about the Friends of Michaux, as Pam said, we formed in 2019, so we're still a pretty young group. And we are a chapter of the Pennsylvania Parks and Forestry Foundation, like many Friends group in Pennsylvania. We're formed under the PPFF, and our mission is to foster the preservation and enhancement of the forest recreational, cultural, and natural resources. The kind of heart of our logo is, hands with the little tree seedling in it, and that's because Michaux is often considered to be one of the cradles of forestry in the United States, which we'll also touch on. And so we tried to create a logo that reflected that. And we do a lot of volunteer and service work and educational work on behalf of the Michaux State Forest. So a little bit about the Michaux. This is a forest that's around 85,000 acres. The Appalachian Trail runs through the heart of it. That's the red line. It's kind of bisected by Route 30. And so it's this forest, and Michaux is a working forest. So it's timbered, it's managed for wildlife habitat and watershed protection. But kind of embedded in Michaux are also these 4 state parks: Kings Gap, Pine Grove Furnace, Caledonia, and then Mont Alto down here at the bottom. And that's kind of important to keep in mind because a lot of people start a hike in one of these state parks and end up in the state forest at some point, but the boundaries aren't always very clearly marked. And so, you might not know, like, hey, I'm in the state forest now or in the state park. And, signage policies, management objectives, care of the trail system is very different if you're in a state park versus a state forest. So we run into a lot of people who launch out of Pine Grove State Park and go into Michaux but never know that they left the park. And so they complain to Andre, who's the chair of the Friends of Pine Grove, and he's like, "That's not my problem. That's the forest." So this is just a map to kind of get us oriented. So look at the history, and I keep forgetting to say this, but thank you all on Zoom who are here tonight. And if you have questions, we're going to hold questions to the end. And if you have questions on Zoom, if you can pop them into the chat, John is kind of going to moderate the chat. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to pop questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully get to them. So as I said, we're going to try to walk through about 10,000 years of history in Michaux. And so I tried to map out what I call the cultural eras. Prehistoric or pre-contact, we had Native Americans coming into Michaux mining the Rhyolite. We call that Michaux's first industry. We have evidence of the frontier era, 18th century European colonizers. We have 19th century industrial period, timber and iron, along with other products. And this period in particular had a massive impact on the forest that we see today. So when you walk around the forest, I'm hoping that you'll get a sense. I mean, I go to the forest because it's quote unquote natural, even though I know that's an illusion, right? Like our forest, when you go in the forest today, you go for natural beauty, but if you just kind of switch your perspective a little bit, you can see all of these different layers. And this is a really important layer in the forest. As we get into the 20th century, that's when the conservation era started. This is really sort of like the recovery after the industrial period, with the formation of the first forestry school and also the work of the CCC. And then if I have time, I'll bring us all the way up to the 21st century, where foresters today manage the Michaux as a multi-use system using ecosystem based management and adaptive management, I think, too. So let's go back 10,000 years. If you haven't been to Carbaugh Run, these are screen captures from the public use map for Michaux, and I have a few copies of that if you want to pick up a copy here. Carbaugh Run is right here. And Carbaugh Run is one of 4 natural areas in the Michaux State Forest. There's Carbaugh over here, there's Mount Sidonia, there's Beartown Woods, and then there's Meeting of the Pines. And these natural areas are kind of set aside to protect special resources. In the case of Carbaugh Run, it is an important area for amphibians and aquatic life, but it was also protected to protect the archaeological resources there. This is a place where Native Americans mined the Rhyolite rock. And again, John can do a better job here. I'm gonna limp through this section. These mines are hard to see unless you know what you're looking for. They kind of just appear as like depressions on the landscape as you're walking through the natural area, but they were heavily utilized by Native Americans. And these mines were places where they would mine the rock and create what are called preforms like this, which isn't really a finished stone tool, but it's something, you don't want to carry like a whole chunk of rock with you out of the forest. So they would sort of winnow them down into preforms that they would work down into finished stone tools at other locations. Rhyolite from Michaux was traded all up and down the eastern seaboard. And there were other places along the east where rhyolite was mined, but this is the only place in Pennsylvania where rhyolite was mined. And so it's a really important resource, cultural resource here in terms of that part of North American history. The Friends of Michaux just got a grant from the South Mountain Partnership to put up some interpretive signs here. This resource at Carbaugh has been heavily impacted by looting. So folks have gone in and rifled through, and so there are still some mines that have been preserved. So the mines that have been heavily looted for like decades and decades are the most visible mines, the most accessible near the Carbaugh parking area. That's where these interpretive signs are going to go in. But ultimately, the forest is trying very hard to protect and keep these resources undisturbed using rangers and camera traps and things like that. So keep that in mind if any of you guys get funny ideas about looting and Carbaugh. Fast forwarding several thousand years to the frontier era, this time period has a lighter footprint on Michaux because it was pretty mountainous. It was used for timber. There's also evidence of farms, and there's one example at Camp Michaux. So this is up near Pine Grove Furnace. And the Bunker Hill Farm, this is a picture, I think, from the 30s?
1913.
Oh, 1913, okay. The Bunker Hill Farm, we think was established around 1785. And I'm sure, you all probably know that our area was kind of central for German immigrants coming into the Cumberland Valley. And the Bunker Farm is an example of what a frontier farm would have been like. You know, they would have produced grains, animal products, wool. This farm, and actually up until 2007, is that when the wall came down?
2016.
2016. Oh, see, that's why Andre's here. Up until 2016, you would have seen at least the remnants of this big stone barn that was part of Bunker Hill Farm. But it, you know, the way that that many of these cultural resources kind of are managed in Michaux is to sort of let time take its toll. So, you know, so we sort of we can sort of see the footprints of these activities, but they're not as heavily developed as they are, for example, in some of the state parks. So this wall collapsed in 2016. You can still, again, sort of see, and there's some interpretive signs here. But Bunker Hill was eventually incorporated into land holdings by the mining industry. So keep this in mind. I'll come back to this idea of old farms. As we go into the industrial era, the big story in Michaux, oh, okay, sorry, thank you. The story in Michaux, unlike some of many of the other state forests, is about iron. And that makes Michaux kind of unique because, again, in the other state forests, the story was about timber. So those trees were cut over and sort of abandoned. In Michaux, trees were harvested for charcoal, which fed the iron industry. And Andre is going to talk a lot about that next week. This is Pine Grove Furnace. But again, when you are walking in Michaux, I think pretty much all of the trees in Michaux were cut over and cut over and cut over. So they did what's called coppicing. So they would cut the tree would resprout, and after a few years they cut it again. So it was just, you know, repeated cutting. And so when you're walking in Michaux and you see an old tree, you know, that tree might be 60 or 80 or 100 years old above ground, but the roots underneath might actually be a lot older than that. Because, you know, a lot of the trees just sort of resprouted. So so that's again sort of the forests of Michaux were heavily influenced by that, and the landscape. And so just to show a couple of images of what Pine Grove Furnace looked like back when they were producing ore. This is the furnace stack, which is right here, I think. In that photo. And so this was, you know, an industrial landscape. And now when people go to Pine Grove Furnace State Park, they go for a hike in the woods. But you know, this landscape, as Andre will talk about next week, is still has a lot of the story to tell of the iron industry. And while Pine Grove Furnace is one of our more famous furnace stacks, there are furnace stacks all over the forest. And again, this imprint is pretty strong. If we go along here, the Shippensburg Road, Big Flat is down here, Cleversburg is here, Shippensburg is over here. This is an 1872 map that shows Augusta Furnace. So Augusta was one of the many furnaces that were in the region, like Pine Grove, but not as big as Pine Grove. And this is a digital surface model of the landscape. So this landscape is now all grown up with trees, but this map lets us kind of see what the earth looks like underneath the tree canopy. And that's the Shippensburg Road going north. And the remains of Augusta Furnace are right here. So they're right along the road, and if you're driving on the Shippensburg Road, this is heading towards Cleversburg. It's just a big pile of rocks on the right-hand side of the road. So if you remember seeing that, if you've been on that road, you just see a big pile of rocks, and that was actually the remains of a furnace. There's also evidence of the head race, which would have provided some hydropower to the furnace. Building foundations on the other side of, this is Bird Run, on the other side of Bird Run, where there would have been the Ironmaster's mansion, potentially worker homes and so forth. And then potentially an old haul road. And then the other thing that you see, a dime a dozen in Michaux, are charcoal hearths. These are places where timber would be collected from the surrounding landscape, taken to these kind of centralized locations, and then put through a process that turned that timber into charcoal, which fed Augusta furnace. And there are 6,000, 7,000, 10,000 of these charcoal hearths around in Michaux. So Andre will tell you how to recognize them, but once you see one, you will see them everywhere you go in Michaux. Again, iron was the big story in Michaux, but we also have some copper mines in the south. So this is down, well, here's Beartown down here. This is the far southern end of Michaux near Fairfield. And right here, this is the Mount Hope Trail system, if there's any equestrians here. Right down here is another old farm, the Russel Farm. And you can see on this map from 1885, the Russel Farm with copper mines and several shafts labeled. Today, when you look at the Russel Farm, it's being taken over by invasive species as the farm kind of returns to forest, and it's a scenic place. It's a nice place to hike or ride your horse. But again, we see a lot of evidence from this activity of copper mining. This was a small industry. Here's Russel Farm. Here's that pond that was in the previous picture. And just above that, all of this disturbed land here is a copper mining complex. There's another copper mine up at the upper right of that, of this photo, of this map. And again, when you go out and walk around, this area right here looks like this. So it's just a very, hummocky, deep, but along this stretch, there's one of these holes that has a very deep shaft in it from copper mining. Here's another picture. Again, it doesn't jump out at you, but if you know what you're looking for, you can say, oh, that something happened here, and it ends up it was copper mining. This is the copper mine at the north. Very close road access. So it became a dumping ground. This is one of the reasons why the Friends of Michaux exists, because one of the biggest things we do is like trash pickup. I'm sure the foresters know about this, but it's been on my mind to talk to them and see what we can do there. So that's the industrial era. And again, very heavy impact on the forest. If you can imagine at the end of the industrial era, or as we're transitioning into the 20th century, all of the forests had been cut over and cut over and cut over. Habitat was destroyed, soil erosion was a problem. And also the iron industry was collapsing. And so as the iron industry was collapsing, and this kind of industrialized landscape was left over, we go into the conservation era, which we can really, this is a chart, and I'll come back to this a few times because it helps to sort of organize how we think about these different eras in Michaux. In the early 1900s, you can see an early land sale, and I want to try to find out more information about James Dole and this 558-acre purchase. But the Mont Alto Iron Company went out of business. The Caledonia Mining Company went out of business. And those big parcels of land were transferred or sold to the state. And so in the early 1900s, the state started to form what they were calling forest reserves. And there were actually 3 or 4 forest reserves. And Andre shared a news article with me that I think in the 1915 or 1917 or so is the first time we saw the name Michaux.
Probably the end of 1920.
Okay.
Consolidated reserve.
Yeah, so these kind of came into being as separate reserves and then eventually were consolidated into what we now know as Michaux State Forest. So this is the collapse of the iron industry. And then in the early 1900s, that's also when we see the formation of the Pennsylvania State Forestry Academy at Mont Alto, which was formed in 1903. All first-year students were required to bring a horse with them until the late 1920s. They were used to fight forest fires, and these are Forest Academy students in front of Weisling Hall during the autumn of 1904. So just a couple years after the school was formed. Forestry in the early 1900s was just starting to become a professional discipline. And so this was, Mont Alto was one of 3 that opened up in the early 1900s, along with the Biltmore Forestry School and the Yale Forestry School. So it was, on the forefront of that. And that's why Michaux is referred to as one of the cradles of forestry, because we had this kind of early adoption of science-informed or science-based management of forests. And also remember that in the early 1900s, a lot of the forests had just been cut over. So the main focus of the forestry school in its early years was on how can we bring the forest back and make it productive again, make it productive for timber. That was the other thing early, in the early era of professional forestry, there was a large focus mostly on timber production, but that has also evolved over time. The other thing that I think is interesting and notable about Mont Alto is that the first Black forester in the United States graduated from Mont Alto in 1906. The first Black forester in the nation was Ralph Brock. So again, notable first, right? So early 1900s, we start to see professional forestry and conservation come into play. As we go into, sort of the 20s and 30s, Michaux starts to expand. It continues to pick up small pieces of property up through the 1930s. And this is when we get into the era of the Civilian Conservation Corps. If you're not familiar with the CCC, this was a program, let me get my notes here, that came about because of the Great Depression. where we had extremely high rates of unemployment. So this was a federal program put in place under Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. When he came into office in 1933, this was one of the first things that he started. And at the top, one of the top priorities of this program was to get people to work. Well, in particular, to get young men employed. This map shows all of the CCC camps in Pennsylvania. Throughout the CCC era, there were almost 200,000 young men who worked in these camps throughout Pennsylvania. And there were, let's see. Most of the young men who came in were poor. They were hungry. They weren't clothed very well. They got paid about $30 a month, most of which was sent home. But they were housed and fed and put to work. And most of them, on average, gained about 40 pounds after they came to work at the CCC, and fat and muscle, I'm guessing. If we look a little closer, these are the CCC camps that were located around the Michaux. So this is Camp Michaux. This is Big Pond, Caledonia, and then Waynesboro. These are also coded, they're numbered, and S means that it was a state forest camp. An SP means it was a state park camp, and an SCS means it was a soil conservation service camp. So depending on the type of camp, you know, the state park camps work to help build infrastructure for the parks. The state forest camps, like in Camp Michaux, the young men in Camp Michaux, these are the operating years of these 4 CCC camps. And the young men in Camp Michaux, this is what Camp Michaux looked like during the CCC era. This is the footprint of some of those buildings today. An overview site of the camp. So again, very open and developed, and now this is all reforested. The young men at Camp Michaux, so this is the cooks and the mess hall. There were about, I think, 200 over the 9-year operating period. There were about 200 men who came to Camp Michaux doing work. They did things like building access roads, planting trees, stringing telephone wire. They did firefighting work. And then they also obviously built the camp itself and maintained the camp itself, which was a very kind of typical experience for folks who worked in state park and forest camps. The soil conservation camps, of which Waynesboro was one, would have done work more on local farms. So helping local farms deal with problems with erosion and soil management, and providing, you know, extra labor for food production. So a little bit of variety in South Central Pennsylvania around Michaux in terms of what these young men did. Again, a very influential period that had I think helped build infrastructure within Michaux State Park, Michaux State Forest, and also helped to reforest. Going into the 40s, so the CCC lasted until World War II broke out and the United States entered the war. And so we sort of see the closing of that era. So if we sort of start to move into what I call the modern era, where going into the 21st century, some of the most recent acquisitions in Michaux State Forest are at the southern end, and there are two large ones, relatively large ones, that came from the Glatfelter company. And Glatfelter was a timber company. It was a pulpwood company. Also, kind of notable because it was the first certified tree farm in the United States. The Glatfelter, let's see, the American tree farm system was started in 1941 and was kind of a continuation of the scientific approach to forestry, but also started to incorporate ideas about multi-use within forests. So not just focusing on timber, but focusing on wildlife and recreation. And with the tree farm system, participating forests had to come up with a management plan that sort of acknowledged and addressed the sort of multi-use role of timber farms. And while the Glatfelter tracts were certainly managed for timber, they were also, it also became very popular for natural and recreational resources. So even while it was privately owned by Glatfelter, it was kind of serving a recreational and natural resource role for South Central Pennsylvania. It became Pennsylvania's first designated tree farm in 1947. That's why it's tree farm number 1. And in 2007, Glatfelter put this property up for sale. There was a great deal of concern about the development potential for this property. So, you know, there was a lot of support for preserving it. And ultimately, obviously, it came into management of Michaux. And pretty much this area down here is what was the Glatfelter property. This was where we have our copper mines down here on the Glatfelter property. But there are also some farms here, and so if you have a chance to visit this part of the forest, this part of the forest actually has kind of a different forest ecosystem as well. So it, you know, my experience in Michaux is like a lot of chestnut, oak, other oaks, maples, pines. When you go to the Glatfelter tract, it's mostly poplar and beech. So it's much more kind of open canopy. Poplars are really tall and straight. And so it's again a little bit different. In the places that were farmed, you'll also see like old stone walls throughout, you know, this area. And like this, the other thing that we see, this is another clue, like if you're in a place that had been farmed, it's taken over with invasives. So Camp Michaux was an open, farmed, mown area, and now as it's growing up, it is taken over by barberry and who knows what. The thing about invasive species, this guy right here is Japanese Angelica, which is this. So invasives are really pokey for some reason. So so that this is another issue that, you know, the state forest has to tackle as these heavily disturbed sites turn back into forest. We have to figure out how to deal effectively with invasive species, because the scale, it's not just, you can't just go in with a crew of volunteers and trim it off. I mean, the scale is way, way beyond, beyond what a few volunteers can do. Okay, so we're gonna spend just a few minutes looking at the contemporary forest. This is another layer on the landscape. Today, the Michaux is managed as a multi-use forest. Timber harvesting is obviously a goal for Michaux, but it's not the only goal. Michaux is broken up into kind of different forest types and also different landscape management units. And a lot of people ask us about, well, they ask the foresters, like, how do you decide on what you're going to cut? You know, how do you decide on what gets cut down, what gets harvested? And there is a plan, but it's an adaptive plan, right? So most of the forests in Michaux they have timber harvesting schedules set. So, you know, it could be an annual or, you know, a multi-decadal, some are on a 150-year rotation. So depending on sort of the age of the forest and when it was last harvested, they are being sort of rotated through. However, I said it's adaptive because there's also a lot of natural and human-caused disturbance events that happen on the Michaux. So for example, well, it's now called the sponge moth, but we more commonly know it as the gypsy moth. The new name for that is the sponge moth. And when you have a sponge moth defoliate the forest, then, and to the extent where there's tree mortality, the foresters would tag that and do what's called a salvage harvest and take out those dead trees. And so, you know, they kind of have to adapt to what the forest throws at them. The same with forest fires or windstorms. That's another common disturbance in Michaux that I'm sure we've all had different experiences with. They would, you know, so they'll adapt to that. And if there's timber value in dead or down trees, then they'll do a salvage harvest. But the other thing is that, well, actually not just Michaux, the state forest system in Pennsylvania is dual certified by both the FSC stands for Forest Stewardship Council and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. These are third-party groups that review our management plans and actually also, you know, come in and see how we're managing the forests to make sure that all of the state forests in Pennsylvania are sustainably managed for both environmental and ecological value as well as social value. So that means all the state forests in Pennsylvania kind of meet those standards, including Michaux. And sustainable forest management is really important. You know, these are some of the, you know, timber production is important, but if you've been to Long Pine Reservoir, that is one of the main drinking water sources for Chambersburg. So watershed management is important in this area in particular. Michaux also manages for wildlife habitat for a lot of our popular game species, and also for endangered or threatened species like the rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes, you're not allowed, are protected in Michaux, so it's illegal to kill rattlesnakes in Michaux State Forest. We also have habitat and presence of the federally endangered bog turtle in Michaux. And so when you have these species, Michaux has a whole extra layer of management to make sure that those species are protected. Another thing that the foresters at Michaux, so my impression is that the foresters at Michaux within the Bureau of Forestry, like a lot of the other state forests are managed quote unquote traditionally. So it's, you know, timber is the main thing, wildlife habitat, sure, but the foresters at Michaux like get crazy ideas like, let's reintroduce fire. Because fire was a natural landscape process in these forests. And as we've learned from a few seasons of pretty extreme forest fires, the practice of fire suppression that has been practiced across all forests in the United States has caused a buildup of fuel, which has made forest fires, has contributed to forest fires being particularly destructive. So Michaux has, they recently brought on a forester who kind of specializes in fire ecology, because they started to do, they started with small burns and then they did bigger burns. So to again reintroduce this, especially along the dry ridge tops of Michaux, forest fire would have been a pretty common and natural occurrence there, but they would have been relatively low intensity events that would have kept the fuel levels low. And so so they do this type of management. This also could potentially help with controlling invasive species. And there's a pretty widespread and significant effort to restore these pine, oak, savanna barrens that would have been pretty common on the ridge tops of Michaux, but they've kind of like grown up, they're overgrown, quote unquote overgrown. So this is at the top of the Canada Hollow Trail. This is a place where there was a sponge moth defoliation that took out a lot of the chestnut oaks. So they did a salvage harvest, and then they're letting this come back as a pine oak barren. That in a few years, 10 or 15 or 20 years, I don't actually know what the rotation is, they would potentially manage this with fire. So they do a low intensity burn to keep this an open kind of forest ecosystem. This is not managed for timber. So, there's a lot of places in Michaux that don't get timbered at all. How are we doing on time? It's 47. Let me just say one more thing that is unique about Michaux within the state forest system, and that is recreation. Because Michaux is so close to so many large population centers, and because we all love it so much, Michaux receives way more and more intense recreational use than any other state forest in the state forest system in Pennsylvania. Over 300,000 visitors per year. A number of events also get hosted in Michaux, like the Iron Masters Challenge, and it gets used by mountain bikers, by ATVs. There's dual sport event. There's runners. There's hikers. There's also 454 leased camps. Some of you all might be leased camp holders somewhere in Michaux. So there's just a lot of people, and we have a lot of impacts. In terms of special events like the Iron Masters Challenge, Michaux hosts 30 to 40% of all of the special events that happen in state forests in Pennsylvania. So Michaux is like the most loved forest in all of the state forests. Michaux also has a lot of recreational resources. We have a shooting range. People come here and hunt and fish. There's also the South Mountain Golf Course. So there's a lot of recreational infrastructure, but because the forest is a working forest and multifunctional and multi-use, recreational resources don't always get the same attention as they do, for example, in a state park. So one of the charms of Michaux is that you get lost because the trails might not be marked very clearly, right? Or people will build their own trails that aren't on the map. And so it's just kind of part of the experience of Michaux right now. But that's also one of the reasons why the Friends Group exists. And so, if you love the Michaux, please practice leave no trace and leave a light footprint. Join the Friends of Michaux. We also have a resource stewardship program. So if there is a part of Michaux that you particularly love, a trail, a vista, a road, you can adopt it and help to maintain it. So I have information up here about the Friends Group. I have a few public use maps, and that's 10,000 years, very, very shallow, dipping the toe in.
Well, we're gonna give a round of applause and then
Yeah.
questions.